morning, friends and countrymen. It is a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It's laundry day, which means I'm not. Oh, wait. Did the live stream cut out already? It might have. Let's see. No, we're still going. Okay. Still in Thailand, so I don't know. The internet has been kind of on and off, but still living on the beach. It's laundry day. I'm actually wearing ballerina tights right now, but you wouldn't know that. You're probably also not wearing pants if you're at home listening to this, because that is the state of the world today. And it's been interesting, actually, because I live a pretty introverted lifestyle. And in terms of the activities I've been doing in quarantine, it hasn't been that different. I write in the morning, I do whatever, my calls, I work out, I hang out. That's kind of what I do normally. In fact, when I'm home in Chiang Mai, sometimes I go days without leaving my property. It's as much space as I typically need as someone who does most of his activities at home. Even my socializing, I try to bring people to me rather than go out. But as many people I've noticed, just like this discomfort with like having to not go places just as the option. And certainly I think if someone is a little more extroverted, it's even more challenging because they're used to having a lot of novelty. But what I think has been interesting has been the perception of time in this time, because it actually reminds me of the movie Room, which I think it won the Oscar in 2016. It's about the woman who is abducted and then she has a baby in captivity, and then her son grows up only knowing like a 10 by 10 room. Like that's the universe to him. So when he finally escapes, and he sees the world and how much space there actually is in the world, he realizes that there's less time in the world because you're trying to get from space to space. Anyways, made me think, because even though I'm in a relatively large area right now, I can walk around. There's the beach right there, so I'm not really quarantined. I have noticed it feels like I have way more time just because I'm not physically moving through space as much. So it's been interesting. Confrontation of boredom, confrontation of it's especially when we're bored, there's a temptation to scroll social media more, fill our time with nonsense more. But I think it's a great opportunity to contemplate. And if you're in the Facebook group, I put out a little poll on what's a resonant term for guys who want to contemplate, and everyone chose the word contemplation over introspection and some other options. So I'm actually coming out with something soon to give men specifically a reminder of the joys of contemplation and contemplating life. Anyway, so if you are listening to this right now and you do feel challenged by boredom or attention or anything like that, hopefully this is not boring to you, but wherever you are, whatever time it is, most people listen to this in the future. So take a deep breath, settle into your body, remember all those grounding skills, which you may have learned from various things, perhaps stuff that I've put out. And just remember that whatever you choose to pay attention to, you will get more of that thing. You'll get the more value of that action or activity or person if you actually just pay full attention. I think that's a particular challenge right now, because we have extra time, or the perception of time is greater because we have less physical space to roam around in. Anyway, so today's topic is on the father nature and the birth of the hero. A couple weeks ago, we did the one on slaying Medusa, overcoming the mother complex, how that relates to the earlier parts of human development. We're speaking specifically on the masculine hero's journey. The mother complex is right in the beginning of Joseph Campbell's monomyth, in the sense of like, in order to separate from your literal mother or the domain of your maternal influence, it directly correlates to the anthropological move of human beings away from being just another animal who just goes with the flow of nature. The symbol for that is the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. Anyway, that's all in last episode. And I was thinking about actually pushing this off another week, because I'm still reading the very dense Eric Neumann book on the origins of consciousness. There's a little more for me to read on his takes on the birth of the hero. But I decided to just do it today anyway, because last week I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my heroes. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman was on the podcast. His episode's coming out in a couple days. I think on Thursday is episode 81 of the interviews on the Ruwando podcast. But it was really significant to me, other than just being a really interesting interview, and I highly recommend it for anybody. He speaks about the psychology of killing and the psychology of combat, and the protector archetype within being a man. But it was significant to me because his book on killing, which is on the psychology of killing, I read when I was an officer candidate in the Marine Corps in 2009. So this all ties into today's topic. So I'm going to tell this briefly. Growing up, I had the insecurities around masculinity that many people do. I think maybe I had it worse than most boys for various reasons related to my father, Ruwan, which I'll get into. And of course, the idea of joining the Marines specifically, I was like, if there's any place where I can become a man and get over my wimpy tendencies or my fears and whatever, it's in the Marine Corps. So I pursued this career in the Marine Corps through college. I spent 2 summers in Quantico earning my commission. In 2009, I earned my lieutenant commission. So I just had another year to go where I had to just finish. I graduated in 2010 from university. I had to get my degree, and then I could be a lieutenant in the Marines. And that was my plan. Like that year, I was super gung-ho. I woke up at dawn every day. Every night I was reading all the books on the Commandant's reading list, like all the recommended reading from Marine officers. And one of those books was Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's book on killing. And it was one of the major factors that made me decide not to join the Marines, because after reading his book and seeing the psychological toll that modern military training takes on men, I was like, you know what? My primary driver for the Marine Corps is seeing adventures, seeing what I've made of, the character development. If I come back with like my head kind of messed up, it kind of defeats my purpose. And aside from that, I thought if my purposes are all like kind of self-focused, maybe I shouldn't be leading Marines in combat. That's probably not the best reason. Anyway, what was particularly meaningful, other than just being able to interview this writer, veteran who has written books that have influenced my life, is that he gave me a lot of validation, which, I mean, on terms of love languages, I'm not high on the words of affirmation thing. I don't really need compliments from people. They don't do a lot for me, but there's something particularly meaningful about him giving me like a lot of praise on my podcast. I guess he had gone through all of my stuff online, and he had, I think he even like went through my arousal control course, which I was really surprised because he's a very Christian, conservative guy. But he said a lot of like positive things about me. And I realized like something in me like kind of healed, in that like he as a war hero is kind of or a veteran, I should say, is kind of, and a writer, kind of like a lot of the things that I felt like I was missing from my male role model. I'll speak about my actual relationship with my father in a second, but basically he was short in those areas. And my insecurities in my masculinity kind of drew from my father's character flaws. And my dad, great guy, had a lot of virtues. These are the areas that he was weak in: confidence, toughness, grit, creativity, things like that. And those are the things I was insecure about growing up. So to have this guy who kind of would fill in for the secondary father, which we'll define in a second, to have him validate me, I was like, wow, this is kind of like a completion of a cycle for myself in terms of my own father wounding. Got to talk about this on Monday. So here we are. Okay, so just like we did with the mother complex, we're going to speak about this topic on 3 layers. The first layer, the one that should be most meaningful to you, is how this relates to your own development of consciousness. In Jungian terms, it's like the development of personality. I think personality means something a little bit different in the way we use it commonly now, but is in the development of your individuation, going from your boyhood self through your ego, son of swords, into the man, your exalted self, or whatever it is, your individuated self-actualized self. This is an important phase. And even though I think a sign of the times right now is men being stuck in their mother complexes, the father complex is just as meaningful. And throughout history, it has been a sticking point, I'd say, for many men in like achieving their own greatness or expressing their own kingliness or their own masculine archetype. So that's the first layer, the individual hero, how it fits in the individual hero's journey. The second layer is kind of a more academic layer, but I think is interesting, is how all of this ties to the anthropological development of humankind. That's Eric Neumann's thesis, as you remember from last episode. He basically maps the development of an individual person's consciousness to the development of consciousness within human beings. So like toddler self kind of matches with Neolithic ancestors. Your adolescent self is kind of like an early Homo sapiens. Your individuated self is correlates with Homo sapiens as we are today. And then finally, just to ground us in a few stories, I'm going to share about my own experiences with my relationship to my father archetype and my literal father. Okay, so just to give us context within the hero's journey, Again, the mother stuff. If you remember, if you are somewhat aware with Joseph Campbell's monomyth, the hero's journey is a structure that you see in a lot of mythologies across cultures, and in modern day movies. Marvel movies always follow exactly this hero journey story structure. Why? Because it mirrors, it demonstrates or symbolizes the experience of our own individuation. So there's different stages within the hero's journey. It's seen in Star Wars and Marvel movies, in Lord of the Rings, many mythologies and stuff. The hero initially is in the status quo. In the top of the circle, he's in the realm of regular people doing regular things. He's Frodo in the Shire. He's Luke Skywalker on Tatooine. Life is boring as usual, but he has this urge inside of him. Something happens, gives him the call to adventure, and then he has the opportunity to cross the threshold. In most movies, at first he refuses the call for various reasons. This is because most of us, when confronted with an opportunity for growth, initially will resist it because growth is uncomfortable. It's easier to stay in our status quo. But at some point, something happens. Spider-Man's uncle dies. Luke Skywalker's family is slaughtered, or whatever, and he has to cross the threshold out of the status quo into the realm of the unknown, which represents our movement from superficial, boring life where our ego can just remain as a static whatever, into our own unconscious, and then return as a hero. So the mother complex it represents the crossing of the threshold where we detach from the safety of our maternal nest and become an individual entity. So as we spoke about last time, guys who are stuck in mother complexes they might like physically move away from home or do all these things, but they're still attached. Their identity is still attached to their mother. They still have a metaphoric umbilical cord. Cutting that, the slaying the Medusa myth, and many other mythologies where a hero defeats like an evil older female figure like Medusa, represents this separation. The next stage is slaying the father. So there's a lot of mythologies like Oedipus, which we talked about last episode, where the hero kills a father figure or some sort of paternal figure. And this represents something a little bit different, because the moving away from the mother and slaying the mother represents separating from nature, so separating from our animal instincts. This is also shown in the garden in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve leave their father's kingdom. I mean, it gets twisted when you talk about patriarchal religions, but that is leaving nature. They're leaving the abundance of nature and moving out into the world on their own. That's the birth of human consciousness. Slaying the father, on the other hand, is the hero separating from culture. So it's the hero separating from, instead of the natural norms of being an animal, it's separating from the human norms of whatever your culture is. And this is an important step in individuation, because as you can probably, it's obvious, if you are stuck on other people's culture, and the representation here is if you're constantly following your primary father or your literal father figures, everything, you're not actually taking your own path. So this is shown in the prodigal son parable in the Bible as well, where the son leaves his father's home, chooses to come back, but he chooses to come back on his own volition, as opposed to just going along with his father's life because his father said so. So this was done, we're switching to the anthropological side of things. In pre-agricultural societies, or many indigenous societies, this has been seen in how children very often, in many of these societies were, they had like, what's the word? Spoke about in Sex at Dawn, Christopher Ryan's book, about how most of the time people didn't even know who their fathers were because they didn't really have a sense of monogamy or sexual exclusivity. So very often people knew who their mother was because they came out of their mother's body, but they didn't always know who their father was because there wasn't necessarily ownership of women or sexuality. This was pre-patriarchy, pre-agriculture. In many of these societies, people just slept with each other. In a lot of these societies, they've noted that they didn't even realize there's a connection between sex and children, because everyone was kind of just having sex, and children happened when they happened. And this is also why in Judaism, you're considered Jewish if your mother's Jewish, because pre-agriculture, again, without enforced monogamy and the norm of monogamy, you didn't always know who your father was. So you always knew who your mother was because you literally came out of her body. This is also why bonobo monkeys, not chimpanzees, the bonobos are similar to us, but they, unlike chimpanzees who have a lot of like the patriarchal aggressive behavior that humans exhibit, bonobos have a lot of the matriarchal tendencies that humans have in terms of egalitarianism and free love and or like the impulse towards sexuality. Anyway, so in pre-agricultural indigenous societies, the common practice was to create a rite of passage. So a child lived in the land of women. You know, he lived with the other children, had his mother, her mother, and all the other mothers around. It's the land of women where they're safe, and this represents again like the womb. They're within that. Around the time of puberty, the child, the boy specifically, was abducted by the men of the tribe, taken away from his mother, and put through a rite of passage, which was typically physically and spiritually challenging events. There's all sorts of examples of this, something where they're battling the elements or physically in some sort of simulated combat or literal combat that wouldn't kill him, but it gave him the opportunity to dig deep and see what he was made of because his mother was no longer there to protect him. And the whole idea behind these rites of passage is that it forced the boy to really learn how to self-soothe. Self-soothe is Robert Glover's term. He wrote No Mr. Nice Guy. And actually one of his theses is that guys who are stuck in nice guy syndrome become extra dependent on women, or they maternalize the women in their lives because they've never learned how to soothe themselves. If I referenced this in the last episode of the Mother Complex, one of the roots of misogyny and fear of women and therefore hate of women, as Yoda said in episode 1, fear turns to anger, anger turns to hate, hate turns to suffering. Part of the root of misogyny is that many men and collectively masculine consciousness has been uncomfortable with their dependency on the feminine for nurturing and then later for sex and affection and all the things that men can't give each other. Like there's certain things that particularly, I guess, a straight man or any man can only really get from the feminine side of the psyche or women. So the rite of passage, again, because the mother wasn't there to nurture him or soothe him, he has to learn to access his own inner feminine, his own ability to soothe himself and become a sovereign individual. So that's the purpose of the rite of passage. In modern day, we don't have those institutionalized rites of passages, but a lot of people have those that drive for it anyway, that unconscious impulse for that. One aspect of the rite of passage of going from the mother's world into the land of men is male bonding, and you can see how in things like male gangs in the military and fraternities, there's always a hazing process. If you ask someone, I mean, I was on the rugby team in college. We had a hazing process. I've been in fraternities. We had something like that. Basic training in the military, obviously, we don't call it hazing, but it is hazing. You're putting a lot of stress on these recruits so that by the end of basic training, they are badasses or they're tough, but they're also bonded to the group. And you can see this is, if you ask someone, if you ask a drill instructor, if you ask a fraternity brother, like, why are you doing these things? He might say something like, it's for bonding, it's to show you what you're made of. All of that stuff is true. It's also just like the unconscious drive to like claim your own sovereign masculinity. And even as simple as why typically the average guy will get wasted during his bachelor party or get wasted every weekend. It's like this unconscious drive for a humbling or humiliating experience that can really force you to get to know what's inside of you instead of just your surface level persona. So with the slaying of the father, we'll get to slaying of the father in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I've already done that. So in mythologies, one of the types of stories that demonstrates the birth of the hero or this freeing of the anima is the whole idea of the knight slaying the dragon to save the princess. You can see this in medieval mythologies. I think it's interesting that it's so common specifically in medieval mythologies, maybe because the collective consciousness of the world in the Middle Ages was kind of stuck in this aspect or this stage of the hero's journey, perhaps. But in the typical hero slays the dragon, saves the princess. The dragon represents a different form of the Ouroboros. So if you remember from last episode again, the Ouroboros is the snake eating its tail. and that represents nature. Like nature's constantly eating itself. Things are born and things die, and it's a seamless experience. So I just realized that since I am literally outside right now in nature, the video feed is flashing in weird ways. But anyway, most people listen to the audio, so says the internet stats. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. Okay. So the dragon represents a different form of the Ouroboros. So the Ouroboros is a snake. A dragon is kind of a snake on steroids. If you think of how people came up with this the dragon is also interesting because it's one of these symbols that has been across cultures. It's like the Chinese came up with the dragon, but also medieval Europe also came up with their own versions of the dragon. There's I think it's called the Fafnir in Norse mythology. Different parts of Europe have different forms of dragons. Asia had their own dragons. Like, what is the deal with the dragon? Like, they weren't communicating with each other. I guess it's possible that some travelers shared a myth about dragons and they copied it or changed it. They turned it into a meme. But I think the dragon is one of these symbols that came from deep in the collective unconscious because it represents this kind of devilish part of nature. So Neumann and Jung share. They get really hung up on the differences between introverts and extroverts. For them, I mean, they coined the term back in the early 1900s, so they could use it however they wanted. But they would say that introverts, for them, the dragon slaying mythology directly represents their own demons. Like an introvert listens to the story. Okay, we just had a comment. Someone said the dragon represents what? To an introvert, the dragon represents one's demons, and it's a movement from the mother complex snake, the Ouroboros, into, like, once the hero overcomes his mother complex, now he's an individual entity, and it's like he's seeing the boss again if you think of it as a video game, it's like the boss has returned, and now he's, instead of a Bulbasaur, he's a Venusaur, to use Pokemon terms. I hope you got that reference. So the dragon, and Jung was saying that an introvert sees the dragon or sees a story and immediately relates it to his own internal archetypes. Introverts tend to their mind just tends to go that way. They watch a story, immediately, even unconsciously, this is my own demons. An extrovert tends to take the idea of the archetypes and project it onto the world. They also use the term centrovert. I'm going to get to that later. So the princess, so going back to the whole point of the rites of passage, the princess in the story represents one's own anima. And Jung and Neumann use this term crystallization of the anima because it's like the creation of your feminine aspect of psyche as its own entity, as opposed to something attached to the mother. When in the mother complex, prior to the creation of the hero crossing the threshold, a young boy's feminine is his mother. Like, he doesn't consider that he has his own feminine side. The feminine in his entire life experience is coming from the literal woman who's giving him nurturing, who's maybe feeding him from her breast, whatever. The dragon slaying story represents slaying your own demons, slaying your own the things that resist you, to allow you to have access to your own feminine, which gives you your own ability to feel your own emotions, to connect with people intimately, not in a maternal sense, but again, as a peer to the feminine, and also access your own creativity. This is the seat of all of that. So this is where, in the dragon slaying myth, a man or a boy removes his dependence on his mother, or really dependence on any woman to give him a certain thing. And you can see this in many women today complain about dating man children, or the term fuckboy gets used. These are men who don't have access to their own anima, so they project maternal characteristics onto the women that they're intimate with, and it ends up being an unpleasant situation for the woman they're dating because they don't get to be a lover when they're being a mother at the same time. So, so slaying the mother, as we mentioned, represents overcoming nature, leaving the Garden of Eden, overcoming the animal impulses that don't serve us, overcoming our genes, to put it into scientific terms, whereas slaying the father represents overcoming stagnant elements of culture, overcoming our memes. So I'm going to take a quick aside to explain genes and memes. Take a sip of water first. Some people think this is unnecessarily nerdy, but this is my podcast. We're going to talk about it. So genes, most of us know what genes are. They're packets of information within our chromosome that make up our body. But I think it's really great the way Richard Dawkins explains how to visualize it. If you think of your chromosome as a binder full of pages, and each page is information about some part of your body. What a gene is a sequence of pages that, for whatever reason, has found its way to replicate itself in that sequence in a child. So, and you would only call a gene is not a standard unit. A gene can be 20 pages. A gene can be 2 pages. It could be 200 pages. A gene is just some unit that has repeated itself in that exact sequence. And this is because it's somehow found a way to persist, either by sneaking its way into the chromosome like a recessive gene, or actually contributing to the health and well-being and survival of the offspring, which is why it passes on. If there's a gene or a sequence of pages that makes an individual kill himself before he has children, that gene will not pass on, and we wouldn't even call it a gene because it's not a gene unless it actually repeats over and over again. And you can see how when it comes to recessive genes or anything that and not even recessive genes, anything that leads to our behavior, a lot of our instinctive behavior doesn't actually serve us as a conscious individual. So a lot of the times, like this whole idea of battling nature, overcoming nature, is overcoming our genetic programming. One obvious example would be most of us, almost all of us, have this predisposition to enjoy sugar. Why? Because there's a gene that leads to the enjoyment of sugar. Why? Because in nature, anytime you come across blueberries, you should probably eat them, but they weren't that common. Nowadays, we have processed sugars, so this impulse, this instinct to eat sugar obviously is not good for us because the world has changed. There's other instincts like that. One of the, I guess I'll pick an extreme one in the other direction. There's an experience, controversial extreme experience that has been documented on how rape victims very often will have an orgasm in the terror of being raped. Seems very crazy. It seems very counterintuitive. Why would I'll say a woman experience this moment of pleasure in this moment of terror? I think this specifically has been documented to cause a lot of PTSD experiences in sexual abuse survivors because they don't understand why their body would have this pleasurable experience in the midst of this very terrible experience. And that's simply because there is our genes don't really care about our mental well-being. Our genes just program us to do things that will allow us to procreate and experience their genes. And unfortunately, in the animal kingdom, rape is one of these strategies. I'm just thinking, I used to have betta fish when I was in college, and betta fish are the fighting fish. And I really loved my betta fish. Betta fish, like they're predator fish, so their eyes are in the front of their head. They have personalities, but you can't put them in the same bowl as another betta fish because they end up killing each other. I had this male betta fish. I was really into this. As much as a young man can be bonded to his fish, I really liked my fish. He had a personality. It was a beautiful fish. Anyway, and I'm sounding weird talking about my fish, but he started doing the betta fish mating ritual, which is building a bubble nest. And I'm like, oh, my beloved little fish. His name was Tornado, because I bought him on Halloween while I was dressed as Zorro. And I believe that that's the name of Zorro's horse. Anyway, that's why I bought him. I wanted to get him a female fish so that he can procreate because he was doing the mating ritual. He was building a nest to put eggs in. I didn't realize how violent the betta fish procreation or mating ritual was. Basically, the male chases the female around, kind of beats her up, and then squeezes the eggs out of her. Sometimes she dies from that. Then he scoops up the eggs, puts them in the nest, and fertilizes them. I didn't realize it was so violent. I would not have put a betta fish through this. I just thought it was nature happening. So basically, my female betta fish who I bought got beaten up really terribly, and she actually jumped out of the tank. And it was like in a full aquarium, so she had to jump out of the hole. And a couple times, like I saw her on the floor, still breathing because betta fish can breathe air. Anyway, I thought this was, I felt so bad. I was like, okay, you know what? Procreation is not worth this terror. So I put her in a bowl, and I put her bowl away from my fish. I was in college, so I put the bowl in my roommate's bedroom, and he had his own betta fish, his own male betta fish in another bowl. And my female betta fish was so like aggro from being beaten up by my fish that she jumped out of her bowl into my roommate's fish's bowl and killed the fish. That's nature. Nature is metal. This is how it goes. So anyway, is all to say that our genetic instincts are not always in favor of our well-being. In fact, many of the behaviors that we dislike about ourselves or that are unconducive to well-being are coming from our genetic programming to try to get us to survive and replicate. Things like anger and violence are part of that. Also, the topic of the next podcast with Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, I highly recommend it. Lots of interesting insights on violence. Anyway, slaying of the father, though, is overcoming memes. So this is the next thing I had to define, because with internet memes, most people don't know what the word meme is. Most people think a meme is just a joke on the internet. That's not the case. A meme is a unit of culture. If a gene is a unit of nature, a unit of like what makes up your body, a meme is a unit of culture. It's a unit of how we view reality, or how we view society and culture. So Richard Dawkins also actually coined the term meme, not in terms of internet jokes. But the reason why we call it a meme is anything that repeats itself, as any idea that repeats itself with slight modification over time. Just like a gene is something that repeats itself in the chromosomes of parent to offspring. We call them internet memes because usually it's a joke, or it's like a photo with a caption, and it gets shared over and over again, and oftentimes it'll get slightly modified. So like if you think of like the philosopher raptor or the success kid, like you'll see, or like the Willy Wonka thing, you all know what memes are. You'll see the same images with slightly different tweaks, and it's like what makes them particularly funny is that we see the same recognizable image that made us laugh within a slightly new caption, and it's interesting. But memes are any idea that get passed around over and over again. So a lot of the memes that we get as children or as society members come from the paternal side or masculine side of our environment. So it might be your literal father. If you had a traditional household with traditional gender roles, your father might have called all the shots. Chances are, if you're a younger person, you grew up in a feminist influenced world, that might have not been the case. Maybe your mother wore the pants, but it doesn't matter. The masculine side of the psyche, the testosterone-driven behaviors, typically are what create the norms of society, especially in modern times where even with feminism, we still run on very patriarchal norms and assumptions. And actually, feminism itself runs on patriarchal norms and assumptions, but that's a long tangent that I won't get into today. So in the mythologies where they demonstrate the father wounding, very often they'll have experiences where the hero is expected to follow in his father's footsteps, but he wants to do something else. Like he doesn't want to be king. He wants to be an artist. Or actually in the origin story of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, who is the person who became the Buddha that Buddhism is based on, he was born as a prince. He was supposed to become king. He was supposed to be separate from the poor and everything, but he didn't want to do that. He went out and experienced the poor. He experienced life. And he was like, I don't want to follow my father's footsteps of being a king or a tyrant. I want to be with the people. So this was an experience of him saying no to his primary father. Whether it is your literal father that you're following by default or not, or just the masculine norm set by our society, it's not about whether you do what your dad says or not. It's about whether or not you actively choose to do those things rather than just doing it because your paternal influence said to, or whatnot. I'm going to read this quote by Neumann. The exception. So he's talking about how the norm for most individuals throughout post-agricultural history, most men just follow their father's footsteps throughout most of time. If like your father was a shoemaker, you became a shoemaker, no questions about it. Very little societal mobility, very little choice. And he was saying this was the norm. This has been the norm throughout post-agricultural society. The exception to the sameness between fathers and sons is the creative individual, the hero. The hero has to awaken sleeping images of the future, which can and must come from the night, in order to give the world a new and better face. This necessarily makes him a break of old law. So a lot of these mythologies involve someone challenging the old king or the old law or the norms of the society. And in the quote, he says, the sleeping images of the future which come from the night, that means the unconscious. The hero is the one who breaks away from what everyone else is doing, breaks away from his social circle, breaks away from his friend group, quits the job that everyone expected him to do, doesn't follow what his parents expect him to do. And he goes into the unconscious, his own unconscious, but also the collective unconscious, which are not that separate, finds the nuggets of truth that live deep in the collective unconscious and then brings them back. And that might be doing what his father did, but by choice, not by default. I see a lot in guys who, because when we talk about the father wound, a lot of guys who have really great dads, like their dad was a really great role model. He was there, he was attentive. It's a kind of a weird thing where I've seen a lot of guys who have like these heroic fathers, like they have like maybe a famous father or something like that. And they might be in their 30s, 40s, and they still are like a boy because they've never left their own father's shadow. They've throughout the entire adult life. I know a lot of guys like this. They've always just did whatever their dad told them to. And it's not that that's bad. In fact, in those situations, they did it because their dad was such a heroic, brilliant guy. Those men never developed their own security and they never developed their own decisiveness. And very rarely will you see these guys be effective fathers, if fathers at all. In fact, a lot of the guys I speak to who have father complexes can't even imagine having children. It doesn't matter whether you want to have kids or not, but they can't even imagine having children because they themselves still see them as a son to their father rather than their own sovereign father. And just want to make sure I didn't miss anything on that. So the what Neumann defines as a hero is a creative individual who fights the old guard. And I think this is interesting. Why a lot of stories, myths have a hero that is an orphan. Like Harry Potter is a hero orphan. Lyra Silvertongue from the Golden, His Dark Materials children's series, kind of an orphan. She actually literally fights her parents in the book. But I think the orphan symbology, and then see this in even how Jesus was born without a father, that kind of thing. Actually, I'll get into the Jesus myth in a second. That's slightly different. The reason why there's so many orphan protagonists is that this represents a hero that it doesn't have a maternal figure, a paternal figure to rely on. The hero has to go out and find his secondary father, which we'll get into now. So the whole father wound is simply the recognition of the shortcomings of your own paternal influence. So it could be an extreme example is the deadbeat dad who treated you like crap or beat you or walked out on your family. That obviously creates certain wounding and insecurity in a boy who had to become man of the house too young or something like that. Or on the other end, it could be, excuse me, your paternal role model might have been someone who just like had certain character flaws. I think I got stuck up there because I was thinking about how I would speak about my own dad. Like I will say, like my dad was a really great guy. He imparted many great masculine virtues, or just many virtues, into me. Like my dad was a physicist, and he's like very in his head, but also very intellectual and book smart, as you would guess from a physicist. So when I was a kid, like by the time I was 7, I could explain physics better than most of my teachers, just because that's what my dad always talked to me about. But I wasn't, and I appreciate that now as a grown man, but when I was a kid, I wasn't really, being good at physics when you're in elementary school doesn't really get you any cool points. The things I was insecure about were the things that my actual dad is flawed in, which is confidence, the ability to socialize, leadership, being able to be tough. And I remember, like, when I think about the father wound in myself, I can think of like specific instances when I was a young kid and I would see my dad back down to someone. I mean, there's one, it makes me emotional still, but like, I remember like, my dad had just picked me up from Little League practice and we got into a minor car accident with some car, but it was 100% the other car's fault. The other car like just wasn't looking and just bumped into our car, and my dad and the guy got out and they exchanged words. And I don't remember exactly what was said, but even though it was 100% the other guy's fault, somehow my dad ended up apologizing, and I could see that he was afraid, or I could see that he was intimidated. And like, not that they were going to get into a fist fight over this like minor fender bender, but I remember losing respect for him at that time. And now, I mean, as I grow older, I can forgive him for that and realize no one is perfect, and he was a really great father in many ways. But that kind of thing stuck with me as an insecurity throughout my entire adolescence and young adulthood, because I was afraid of people. I was afraid of confrontation. I was very timid around loud social people in particular. And I throughout my adolescence, I kind of blamed my father for giving me this lack of confidence. And that honestly caused a lot of headbutting and painful exchanges between my father and I. And to be fair, like he and I don't even have a great relationship to this day because of some things. I've done my best to forgive him, but I think, it takes two to tango, of course. So the way that one overcomes the father wound, as recognized by Joseph Campbell, this term is his, the secondary father. This is important because even if you had a perfect heroic dad, or you had a deadbeat dad, or you had a well-meaning dad who just had his own shortcomings, you don't access your own masculinity, your own authentic expression of masculinity, until you seek out the traits that you yourself want to embody. And it might be that your dad is awesome and you choose to follow his footsteps. Or it might be, in my case, I've always been drawn to guys who are kind of opposite my dad, guys who were like really loud, obnoxious. I grew up in a part of Brooklyn where there were a lot of mobsters, and I was really drawn to, not to say that I could tell who was a mobster or not, but I was really drawn to like the Italian Goomba types who were, very blue collar and very loud and very confident. I was always seeking those kinds of role models. I wanted to hang out with those kinds of guys. And much to the anger of my father, who was a very conservative, intellectual guy, he thought it was very uncouth of me he thought these guys were like, trashy dudes. I think he actually used the word trashy a lot, but that's what I was like unconsciously seeking as a secondary father, because I wanted to know these guys who were tough and badasses and had these traits that I felt myself and my father were both lacking in. And this is important because, and you see this in a lot of mythologies, and this is the meeting of the mentor in the hero's journey, where Luke Skywalker seeks out Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is a Jedi. Luke Skywalker wants to be a Jedi. Frodo gets in touch with Gandalf. Harry Potter meets his heroes, all that stuff. This is an important step in yourself. And so now in your real life, you might have access to a mentor. You might, with popular media, we all listen to things and watch things, and there's certain types of people that we are drawn to. Like I've been watching a lot of, although I've been trying to be conscious of my YouTube consumption, but I have been watching a lot of this guy, Wes Watson. He has this channel on YouTube where he basically just gives like, he was in prison for 10 years, and he gives like this hard, no bullshit advice. And it really gets me motivated. It's kind of like this unconscious drive towards a secondary father figure, the type of man who has the traits that you yourself want to experience and express in yourself. This is the whole idea behind apprenticeship. And I'd say a lot of the hazing we see in men's male groups, fraternities, the military gangs, is this attempt to leave the mother, seek out, because whoever's doing the hazing, whether it's a drill instructor or a high-ranking fraternity brother or something, he probably, you wouldn't be drawn to that experience unless the tribal elders had those traits that you yourself want to express. So like in the masculine archetype challenge, this is one of the exercises where we identify the types of traits and the types of people that we're unconsciously drawn to, because there's probably something underexpressed in you that you want to express. And this is the simple practical action to overcome your father wounding. And again, it doesn't matter what your father wounding was, whether it was due to negligence, or maybe your father died young, and even though you can't blame him for passing away, it created this wound or insecurity that there wasn't a male presence. You seeking out that male presence is part of you individuating. It doesn't matter what age you are, because again, like I said, there are 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds with father wounding. There's people who go through their entire life never healing their father wounds or their mother wounds. So again, what the father paternal thing represents is the sense of reality, and we can even call it spiritual dependency. This is the quote unquote higher masculinity as opposed to lower masculinity represented by sexual virility. Because the paternal side of your development is what decides your life direction, the maternal side being your connection to feelings. So simply being able to make your own life choices, in spite of your parents or in spite of your environment, is a major choice. And this is something that comes up a lot when I talk to guys who want to start their own business or travel the world or whatever. The idea of quitting their job or just doing something counterculture is terrifying, not because, many guys are afraid of like they won't make money and stuff, and that's a rational fear, of course. But a lot of people, if they're honest, the real thing stopping them is they're afraid of what their friends are going to think. Their friends taking the place of the father archetype in the sense that they represent what the norms of reality are. If all of your friends got corporate jobs after college and they're all doing that, for you to quit corporate and start your own business is gonna be met by the crabs in the barrel experience, where they're trying to pull you down, or they've gotten used to relating to you as another one of the drones. So for you to try to be your own animal, it's going to experience challenges. And this in itself is your own is its own rite of passage in a sense. Is, can you overcome the judgments or the norms of the other people? Because there's another, I'm just going to say this quote to the end, but your ability to counter the norms of the environment you're in is claiming your own father nature and overcoming your father wounding, which like where we talked about the mother wounds. Guys with mother complexes have a difficult time really connecting with women. They have a difficult time accessing their emotions. They have a difficult time accessing their creativity. Those with the father wound typically have a difficult time making decisions. They have a difficult time taking responsibility. And I think related to this, and I'll speak for myself, is they have challenges around money. Money, because the mother complex represents connection to feeling, the father or intimacy, the father nature connects to security. And in modern times, security is very much tied to money at one point. And in some level, unconsciously, the father nature is also connected to violence and the capacity to actually defend yourself. But most of us in the first world, unless this virus stuff really creates world anarchy, most of us don't have to actually know how to physically defend ourselves. None of us have to carry weapons unless you're in a particular situation, or if you're in law enforcement or in the military. For most of us in the first world, money is a representation of security. And you'll see guys who have this unconscious self-sabotaging pattern towards money, like they can't earn money, or when they have money, they lose it. Very often this is tied to their father archetype within them, whereas like they don't feel like they can take responsibility for security, so they find a way to defer it. Because if you have enough money to take care of yourself, or you have enough money to take care of a family, that is very tied to the father nature. And it's interesting. I speak about the virility paradox, the book on testosterone, quite a bit. I had a podcast with its author. I think it's episode 32, and he said he's a liberal guy. He's very progressive. He actually was trying really hard not to make arguments supporting gender roles or anything like that. But he did share statistics that there's the two highest factors that can predict divorce in heterosexual couples is one, where the woman makes more money than the man, and two, where the woman has particularly high testosterone. Both of these situations, you can imagine in some way emasculate the man or take him out of his masculine role, making him obsolete. And very often these marriages become sexless. It's very unconscious. I mean, most women I speak to, they want to have their own money, they want to have their own career, they want to be independent. But if they really think about it, they usually want to be with the guy who makes more money. Why? Because that lets him take over the security pole, even if she's also wealthy independently. If he's handling the security pole, she gets to relax into her feminine. So I'm only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna bring us home with your ability to be a leader, if only not necessarily leading groups or being in charge or having power over people, but your ability to call your own shots and make your own decisions independent of the group is not only important for your own development as a man and your own individuation and well-being. Neumann and Jung would make this argument that it's also a method of, in quotes, healing the world, in the sense that on a practical level, let's say, if you go through life having these father wounds, anytime you're in a paternal role, whether it's with your own children or followers you have, or if you're manager of a team or something, if you have your own father wounds, if they go unhealed, you're going to in some way pass that on to them in your behaviors. And this becomes, this endless cycle of father wounding, where a boy is wounded by his father. He has his holes he has insecurities in his own masculinity. He passes those insecurities on to the next generation, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you heal that in yourself, you heal the world. And, on a more mystical level, Jung and Neumann would say that in the way that, Neumann's thesis is that by connecting with, or that your growth of individual consciousness maps to human consciousness, he would argue that your ability to become individuated and secure and overcome these woundings of the psyche actually heal the world. And we can think of this in, again, the practical level of like your behaviors pass on the pain to other people or not. I mean, pain could stop with you, or it could just be another node that endlessly passes on insecurities generation after generation. So the thing to understand is that the hero, what defines a hero in the Jungian sense is that the hero is a creative individual in that he creates his own ideas, he creates his own norms, he chooses his own path, which might align with the paths of society, but he doesn't just go along with society. And you see this all the time in so many myths and stories. It's about a guy fighting against the institution. That's actually a type of story in screenwriting known as the institutionalized story. If you happen to be a writer, you may have heard of the book Save the Cat. They talk about different types of stories. This is one of the 10 types of stories where hero fights against the norms of society. The book The Giver is an example of that. I mean, there's plenty where it's one against the society. And it is part of the male hero's journey. I would say people who get stuck in the adolescent phase of rebellion, I would say anarchists or people who are like forever rebellious about everything governmental, they're stuck in half of it. They're creating their own sovereignty and fighting against the stagnant norms of the culture, but they don't actually create a new direction very often the time. They just end up complaining. Yeah. And I'm going to end with this idea that I kind of drew from reading the book. Neumann doesn't actually make this argument explicitly, but last episode I was talking about how I realized that the development of patriarchy and the separation of nature, at least if you go along Neumann's modes of thinking, it was kind of inevitable as like the human consciousness became more logical and became more masculine. It was inevitable that society would become a patriarchy and that we would separate from nature and certain elements of femininity would be oppressed. It's kind of just like how the brain is developed towards logic and away from emotions. But then I got the idea that when integrated, when individual consciousness or collective consciousness is not afraid of the feminine and not afraid of the masculine aspects of the psyche, so not afraid of oxytocin-driven impulses, not afraid of testosterone-driven impulses, but actually has them integrated, this masculine aspect of the psyche creates culture, because culture comes from the logos, creates culture not to overcome or oppress the pathos or feminine nature, but to delight the feminine side of the psyche. And you can see this in healthy masculine-feminine relationships. The man uses his foresight and thinking to create experiences that make the woman, in this case, feel happy and secure and safe in her feminine. And this is my final point. Bring us back to my small healing moment with Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, who in many ways represents a secondary father figure in my psyche, in the sense that he's a veteran and he writes well and he's a badass dude who knows how to kill and take no shit. Wow, I just totally lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. It's funny. In many ways, I feel more comfortable doing these podcasts totally improvised live, because I feel like when there's a live stream, I can't like second guess or bullshit, but sometimes I just lose my train of thought. Anyway, he was talking about the protector archetype and how Lieutenant Colonel Grossman was talking about the protector archetype, and this is like a missing element of masculinity in most men, because of the fact that most of us don't go to war, most of us don't have to fight predators or build our own homes, but this ability to provide and protect the feminine or children or the softer parts of an individual or society is a function of testosterone. It's the reason why men have violent impulses. He was speaking about how the warrior, the person who actually is willing to do battle or protect the tribe or protect the children from the bad wolves out in the world, the warrior stays on edge to give everyone else the luxury of fully relaxing. And he goes actually into the science of what's called parasympathetic backlash, of when you deal with stress, there's a natural switch for your body to heal itself, and many men end up sleeping a lot and having really great sex because the stress flips everything. It's like battling the elements, and having that surge of testosterone needs to balance itself and becoming very receptive and super and have a huge access to pleasure. I'm going to end with this quote by Erich Neumann because I found it motivational and also ties together all our themes today. Neumann wrote, "The growth of individuality and its development are mankind's answer to the perils of the soul that threaten us from within and to the perils of the world that threaten us from without. Magic and religion, art, science, and techniques are man's creative efforts to cope with the threat of the two fronts. At the center of all these endeavors stands the creative individual as the hero, who in the name of the collective, even when he is a lonely figure standing out against it, molds it into shape by molding himself. Eric Neumann. And of course, this means that the hero is the individual who is willing to give no fucks, take no shit, and introduce a new and introduce progress to society, let go of stagnant norms that maybe were useful at one point in societal history but are no longer. And even when everyone else is giving him shit, calling him crazy, he's willing to mold himself to be the thing that he feels is true to his own unconscious, to his own elements of self. And in that way, he ends up helping society. And you can think of the quote often used in Apple commercials for iPhones, the ones who are crazy enough to change the world, or what is it? The ones who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who can. Anyway, last idea in these minutes we have left. I was actually thinking about making an episode before this episode on the Life Triumphant, which is a concept by Walter Russell, who's written about in the book The Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe. A little shout out to Maris, my boy, who I've been on his show. Check out his YouTube channel. He recommended the book to me. And it's about Walter Russell, who is this guy who is extremely prolific. He was a famous inventor, famous sculptor, painter. He's done the iconic busts of many celebrities from the early 1900s, Thomas Edison, all the presidents, the Roosevelts. He was like a guy who fit many lifetimes into one. He was like, he was I think he achieved high success in music and everything, like across the board. He did more in one lifetime than like many men all combined would have done. And he had certain principles and he had this concept of life triumphant, which I was going to make a whole episode on this, but I think I could summarize it in a few minutes. So I'm just going to leave it here because it relates to our theme. A life triumphant is a life where you bring more out in creative expression than you take in value from the world. And it's kind of a beautiful idea. It's very simple, but if you are, especially now in the pandemic, if you are at home consuming, that's great. You should be consuming. Read the great books, listen to the great things that inspire you. But it's so critical, especially in accessing your own individuality and expression, to be bringing forth things into the world. Does it mean you have to have your own blog or write your own book? No, not necessarily, but maybe that's your form of expression. Maybe it's bringing ideas. Maybe it's being an incredible father who brings incredible ideas to your children or to your woman or to your company. Like, you're bringing forth more in creative expression in the sense that you're digging into the unconscious and bringing something new, bringing about a better future in Norman's words, rather than just going along and being a consumer who consumes the ideas and decisiveness and leadership of other people. And Walter Russell listed five principles in creating a life triumphant. I think they're all kind of trite. It's humility, reverence, inspiration, deep purpose, and joy. Not that those aren't real, but that's basically the idea behind a lot of the law of attraction stuff, on which Walter Russell law of attraction stuff is largely based on Walter Russell's ideas, along with Napoleon Hill and whatnot. But within the text in the book, he did share some things which I think are the more important principles to recognize. One being focusing your attention on a specific thing, not scattering it. It's really hard in an electronic age to not scatter your attention on all the shiny balls. But if you focus your attention on one thing, it will create the rails for more and more quality. You might think you're a shitty writer, but you like to write. Well, if you focus on a written piece and you give it a lot of time and energy, not just like you look at it while watching a Facebook video, or you really give it your all, and you're not even like just focus in the moment, but your attention is so on this creative work that you daydream about it. You think about it while you're taking a shit. You think about it on the shower. Something amazing will happen. If only impressive to yourself, something amazing will happen. And that in itself is part of being a hero and a creative individual. The second principle that Walter Russell shared was listening to your own rhythms. This is one of his answers to why he was able to do so many things in a day. He was able to paint crazy things, write music, invent things, socialize with presidents. He said that it was listening to his own rhythms of like, This is kind of a Bruce Lee idea that he shares in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. Eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired. Don't force yourself into things. But in the moment that you're like, I should be writing right now, or I should be doing this right now, or I should lift the weight right now, you do it in that moment. And funnily enough, it was this idea was actually something that was celebrated and like almost canonized when I was in the matriarchal sex cult. Like everything was like follow your feelings like with precision, moment to moment. And it's funny, because like going back to what I was saying in the beginning, I was going to join the Marines partly because of feelings of insecurity in my masculinity, partly wanting to see the world and have an adventure. I actually think I accessed those dormant parts of my masculinity in the matriarchal environment, and I share about that in the podcast episode on when I was in a matriarchal sex cult. So if you haven't caught that, you can check that out. But it was actually being in a feminine environment that I got an opportunity to express my masculinity and creativity and realize what kind of man I actually was. And the third one is get more sleep. Actually, Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, he had a whole thing about how critical sleep is. Most people don't realize how critical sleep is. So I've actually been making a point to get to bed early because, with this time, if you're quarantined, you could stay up all night watching Netflix, or you can ensure you get 7 to 9 hours of sleep because it will make your ability to think better. It'll actually, and we talk about this in the episode with Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, it actually changes your ability to experience courage. Like when you're well rested, you have more access to courage and ballsiness as opposed to when you're fatigued. The whole world is a little more scary. I'm going to share one random last story before we close, because I actually forgot to mention this in the Mother Complex episode, but it relates to this too. Like with toughness, and like I shared about part of my father wounding was seeing that my dad wasn't tough, or he was afraid of conflict, and that was passed down to me. I always felt like smaller than other people. I mean, I'm a physically smaller person, but I also felt like just like I was an easy target for bullies and stuff. And there was something in when I was in the cult. Prior to the cult, I was because of my father wound and trying to seek out toughness and secondary fathers, I was constantly trying to do hypermasculine things. Joined the Marines, I became a boxer, I was a wrestler, I was really into combat sports, and they were all great. They were all very beneficial. I got to interact with really badass father figure type people who helped me become a little tougher. But the thing but funny enough, even when I was a boxer, wrestler, and I was pretty jacked and I kind of had a chip on my shoulder, I was still pretty afraid of people. Like the few times I had confrontations with like drunk guys at parties and stuff, like I felt a level of fear that I still wasn't like man enough, even though I knew how to fight more than the average person. When I was in the sex cult, I was very much getting in touch with my feminine side. And there was an experience where these two like really brolic movers were moving like furniture in for one of the cult members who moved into the house, and these were like really tough the type of guys that I might have like looked up to and been afraid of when I was younger, like really badass, uncouth, big dudes. And one of the guys was an asshole. I was holding the door open for him, and he's like, "Move the fuck out of my way," or he had said something like that. And instead of like cowering or backing down, I was practicing emotional vulnerability for the first time. So I was like, I'm going to confront him and be like, "Hey, listen, man, like I was helping you out. You didn't have to be a jerk. I didn't say you hurt my feelings, but that was basically what I was trying to share, because that was the headspace I was in." And obviously this badass guy, this tough looking guy's bully type, didn't take that well. He got all up in my face. He just got up all in my face like he was going to like fuck me up. And this guy maybe had 150 pounds on me. 100 pounds on me. He was big. And I remember for the first time in my life, and it's actually at this point, I had not been weightlifting. I was probably like the smallest I'd ever been. I think I lost like 10 pounds eating healthy and not lifting weights and doing tons of yoga when I was in the cult. I was like the smallest physically I've ever been. Like he really could have crushed me. But there was something about accessing my own anima, accessing my feelings, where when I looked at him in the eye, instead of like just like sizing up our muscles, I looked at him in the eye and I was like, I can see your fear right now. Like I could see that this big dude who's older than me, bigger than me, flexing, threatening, he's posturing, he's threatening like he's going to beat me up, and he probably could. I could see the fear in his eye, and something about that level of empathy, like he could see that I could see the fear in his eye, and I knew that he wasn't going to throw a punch at me. Like I knew that he was going to back down, and the dude actually backed down. And I don't know. There's probably some lessons you could draw from that, but I thought it was interesting because there's something about um, the more someone postures, the more you can kind of see that he's insecure about his masculinity. Whereas the Bruce Lee type, the mild mannered, actual badass, is so connected to groundedness and feelings and empathy, and perhaps you need to know how to fuck people up too. Like if the guy did swing on me, I don't know that I would have lasted too long in the fight unless I tried to ankle pick him or something. That's the go-to with a big ass dude. Kick him in the nuts or ankle pick him. Anyway, we're gonna end there. Growth of individuality. Go be a hero. And if you've been online right now, I mean, most people don't watch the live stream. If you're watching the video of this, especially, and you've been on your screen for a while, I know this is going to be terrible for my social media analytics, but I really encourage you to get off your screen and do something. Do a high attention exercise, because I'm telling you, it's a little challenging at first. It's like talking with my buddy Jordan Lucalia from Ars Amarata about classical music. Like, classical music isn't pleasurable at first. You kind of have to suffer through it. But when it gets to that octave change later, like, you feel so much reward. And that's what high attention exercises are like, whether you're reading a dense book or writing by hand or doing something where, like, there's not pop-ups that can give you dopamine. Like, you actually have to focus to get the reward. That's where you really mine for the metal within your body. Metal, METTLE, like the virtues. Anyway, I could rant a little longer, but I have things to do as well. So thanks for listening. And as always, the Archetype Challenge is available at ruwando.com/archetype. It's a 21-day challenge full of meditations and exercises to increase your attention span, help you heal father wounding, mother wounding, and access the embodied, authentic expression of your testosterone-driven impulses, which we call the masculine archetype. So enjoy your life. I hope you're all staying safe, and cowabunga.